Are you wondering how the campaign for protect 30% of the ocean by 2030 is going? Then this is the episode for you. We talk about 30 by 30 campaign with Beth Pike from the Marine Conservation Institute and with Angelo Villa-Gomez from the Center of American Progress. We're talking about the effectiveness of the implementation of marine protected areas. And that, I know that sounds like a lot. It's really like once a marine protected area is announced, is it really effective? Is it actually implemented? We're going to talk about the results that they found in their study, reviewing the biggest 100 marine protected areas and finding out whether those are actually implemented. And the number is going to be surprising to you. That's what we're going to talk about in today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey, everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And this is where really you find out the information that you don't really hear about in other places like major websites and the mainstream media. This is you come to this podcast so that you can hear the real conservation that's happening and how well we're actually doing at conservation, which is actually the sort of topic at hand for this podcast. We have Beth Pike from the Marine Conservation Institute and Angelo Villa-Gomez, good friends of mine from the Center of American Progress. Both of these people are just amazing marine conservationists. They're really good friends of mine. I've had the pleasure of knowing them for quite some time. We're all part of the same generation. We're all Generation Xers. And it was great to be able to meet up and to be able to discuss this paper, looking at the effectiveness of the 100 largest marine protected areas around the world. And the number is going to be staggering at how well we're actually doing in the implementation part. We're doing well in the announcing of marine protected areas, where countries will come into, our ocean conferences and the UN Decade of the Ocean conferences and announce these major, marine protected area designations where they, they've done the work to get the designation up there, but then do they actually implement it a year into it, 2 years into it, 5 years into it, 10 years into it? And we're going to find out from both Beth and Angelo, who are on this paper. Beth is the primary author on this paper, the first author, about, is this protection actually, getting kicked into place? Is it actually being implemented? That's what we're going to be talking about on today's episode. So I want to get into it as soon as possible. But before I do, I just want to remind you, if you want to know more about the ocean and what's happening, and you want sort of the stories that you don't normally see online, I am always scouring the internet and searching for information and stories that may not hit mainstream media. I might talk about it on the podcast. So if you want to know more about those articles, and you want to see and hear those podcasts and sometimes see some stuff that's coming on my YouTube channel, then I highly recommend that you sign up for my newsletter at speakupforblue.com/newsletter. That's speakupforblue.com/newsletter, and see how we can go from there and see what you can learn from these newsletters. Come to your inbox Mondays and to Fridays every day of the week, and you'll be able to get access to that. So that's speakupforblue.com/newsletter, speakupforblue.com/newsletter. And here's the interview with Beth and Angelo talking about the effectiveness and of the implementation of the largest 100 marine protected areas around the world. Enjoy the interview, and I'll talk to you after for this. Hey, Beth. Hey, Angelo. Welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about marine protected areas?
Yes.
Right on. Angelo, you ready?
Yeah, let's do it, buddy. I'm excited. Thanks for having me back on the show.
No problem. Beth and Angelo, this is a pleasure to have both of you on. We're here to talk about marine protected areas. There's a big push for 2030 to get, 30 by 30, 30% of the ocean protected by 2030. It's a huge push that we've probably heard. It's so easy to say 30 by 30. We've seen the campaigns, we've seen everything, and we've actually seen some results from that from many of the countries that are participating in this to protect biodiversity, to protect fisheries. But we have a study that you guys did and a paper that you published where you with other authors, where you talked about the effectiveness of these marine protected areas and whether the marine protected areas, the 100 marine protected areas that are really studied in this, that are really as considered marine protected areas, are they effective? And we have some results from there that we're going to talk about, and I'm super excited to do that. But before we do, let's start off with you, Beth. Why don't you just let us know who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Beth Pike. I work for the Marine Conservation Institute based in Seattle, Washington, though I actually live and telecommute from the East Coast, the Boston area. And I've worked there for more than 10 years. And I direct a program called the Marine Protection Atlas, or MPAs for short, which was a nickname we gave it a long time ago, and it really stuck. So it's how most people recognize the program.
And probably one of the biggest tools in marine protected areas in terms of just like finding out where these marine protected areas are and understanding their size and location and things like that,
Yeah.
right? All right, Angelo, you've been on the podcast a number of times. Why don't you just kind of reintroduce yourself and just remind people of who you are and what you do?
Hey, man, my name is Angelo. I was actually your sixth guest ever on this podcast,
It's
like
true.
whatever, like 1923, whenever this thing started. But I'm an ocean advocate, and I believe that we can protect sacred areas on the planet, on the ocean, and I believe that we can have well-managed fisheries, and we can do both of those things at the same time. Originally from a place called Saipan, it's an island next to the Mariana Trench in the Western Pacific Ocean, and I work in Washington, D.C. I've been here for about going on 15 years. And I work for an organization called the Center for American Progress.
And it's a great. We've had some people on from that organization as well. Two great organizations you both work for, really into looking at how to make things better and making sure that not only are we following the 30 by 30, but are we following the 30 by 30 effectively? So Beth, why don't you just kind of give us a little background on the paper that you co-authored or that you're first author on, and sort of the background of why this paper was published.
Yeah, sure. So the Marine Protection Atlas was started, I guess, around 10 years ago now. And initially what we were trying to do was nuance the reporting on marine protected areas, because the official repository, the IUCN's World Database on Protected Areas, was purposely and mandated to report differently than how people in conservation think of these things. And because they were kind of the official progress tracker towards global targets, and so all marine protected areas were counted towards this target. But as a conservation group, we were aware of the fact that these weren't all able to provide the same level of biodiversity, and so calling them monolithic was problematic. And so some of the early on issues we identified were things like the lack of implementation. And it still kind of continues to this day, where the big announcements get all the press and attention, and where the rubber meets the road, when you really implement these things and fund them and maintain them, that doesn't get as much of a press hit as it probably ought to. And we also started to really hone in on the stronger levels of protection, and this kicked off what's now called the MPA guide process a number of years ago. Our numbers were different than the WDPA, because
Right.
we were using a conservation lens to look at these MPAs. And what this allowed us to do was put a real scientific underpinning to what we were doing, and say, here's a framework based on what we know works in science on MPAs, and here's how you not only implement but also protect the ocean to a point where you're really likely to see biodiversity benefits based on what we know works. And so we can't say, everything that we've identified in our study is effective, but what we can say is it's likely to be effective because it has the pieces in place to deliver the biodiversity outcomes. And marine protected areas are really the only area-based management tool that's really designed for conservation and for biodiversity. There's lots of other things that happen on the water for other reasons, but what marine protected areas do and what they're supposed to do is primarily deliver biodiversity benefits. And can they and will they? Depends on how you set them up.
Right. And so, as you mentioned before, the announcement has always dominated in the press. Having a massive MPA announced, being like, "Hey, we've done the work. We've put this together. We're now going to protect the. I guess the assumption is we're now going to protect this one piece of water that we've designed, and it's going to be implemented. But we never really hear back again. That's never the announcement of 1 year later. What have we done? 2 years later or 3 years later, which you would think would happen. But it doesn't necessarily happen to every MPA. We don't really see updates, even a 5-year update or anything like that, or it's never really making big press. Angelo, what are your thoughts sort of on this, like this sort of overview of this paper before we get into the nitty gritty?
Well, ironically enough, the paper that we just published is built off of the MPA guide, which
Hmm.
the MPA Atlas, in the group Marine Conservation Institute that Beth works for, was a huge part of creating the MPA Atlas and the MPA guide. But one of the inspirations behind the MPA guide is actually there were countries going around, and every single year they were announcing that they had created these gigantic protected areas and that they were sacrificing. Um, and then, like when you dug a little bit deeper, you realized that the designations were the protected area was designated, but they hadn't implemented it because they were
Hmm.
waiting for the money to come in. Their promises of conservation dollars to these islands had been promised, and they said, "Oh, we're only going to close the fishery." When the money comes in, and that will sort of offset our losses. And so what was happening is like this country was going around the world to these different international meetings, and while they were fishing and selling the rights to fish in their waters, at the exact same time, they were saying, "Oh, we're sacrificing. This is our commitment to climate change," and there were other islands that were doing more. There were islands that actually had closed down their fishery and that had sacrificed. And there wasn't a shared vocabulary on how to describe all these things. Like, some people were
Hmm.
saying, they're calling it paper park, or they're saying that's a
Yeah.
fake MPA. But
Yeah.
those are very charged accusations, and they don't necessarily have a scientific meaning. So starting in about 2016, a bunch of different partners started putting together what ultimately turned into the MPA guide. And the
Right.
MPA guide was published in Science in 2021. And then what our paper did is we did an analysis of all these big protected areas looking at the MPA guide, and it all goes on the MPA Atlas. Sorry, these are just like the vocabulary that we have
Yeah.
in the world that we live in. Um, and the thing about protected areas, and we'll talk about the findings in the paper in a minute, is that we actually know that they work.
Hmm.
There's studies that show that when an MPA is sited well and it's big enough and it's staffed and it's funded, you get bigger fish, you get more fish, you get higher levels of biodiversity, and you get more amounts of biomass. So the idea behind protected areas is based in science. Like there's a
Yeah.
very large body of science that supports the designation and implementation of marine protected areas. At the same time, uh, this idea of the sacred, the idea that a place or a time of year or a species or a season can be sacred is shared by almost every culture around the world. And you have to sometimes dig through it, to find out how it expresses itself in a particular culture. But in Western science, we call that a marine protected area. But
Right.
I'm a native Chamorro from the island of Saipan. We have we have concepts of conservation in our culture, and many cultures around the world, whether you're Japanese, indigenous, or European, you also have you value parks. I mean, you think of
Right.
the English park is very different from a Yellowstone. It's very different from a
Right.
Japanese park, but it's an appreciation of nature. It's an appreciation of the sacred, but it expresses itself differently. So you have to find a way um, to protect that nature through the right way that a particular culture does it. But what science does is it can provide the tools, and you can make recommendations on what works and what doesn't work. But MPAs can kind of be like a stop sign. Like everybody knows what a stop sign means, right? It means
Yeah.
stop your car. But if you put a stop sign in one neighborhood and you put it in a different neighborhood, and even depending on the time of day, in the same
Hmm.
neighborhood, people are going to engage with that stop sign differently. Sometimes they will come to a full stop, like if there's a school nearby, or if there's a police car sitting nearby. Other times they might roll through it for whatever
Yeah.
reason. And MPAs are the same. The we call these the enabling conditions, and so the specific human cultural conditions based on how this tool is rolled out. Um, affects the outcomes. And again, science is this amazing tool where we can look at all of the different levels of protection of a marine protected area. We can look at the stage of implementation. Is it proposed? Is it designated? Is there a boat? And we can also have qualitative measures and understand these cultural issues that go into effective marine conservation. And we can use the MPA guide and we can use science to predict those outcomes. And so that's kind of what we did with this paper.
Now, at one point, I remember when we went to the International Marine Conservation Congress in Malaysia, there was a huge announcement. Was that the beginning or partly some of the results or some of the action items that came out of the MPA guide? We were talking about like the definition of marine protected areas.
That was the data gathering stage, putting together the MPA guide and building that global shared vocabulary. And you think about there's 15,000 different MPAs, and they have a dozen different rules and whatnot.
Yeah.
And what we've done is we've created a matrix. It's a 4x4 matrix. And so with literally 16 outcomes, right? So we've figured out a way to take all 15,000 of those MPAs and plug them into 16 different boxes.
Yeah.
And that's hard. Right. That you gotta spend some time listening people, because it's not just scientists that are engaged in this. It's also government managers, it's politicians, it's fishermen. And so the development of the MPA guide, I like personally for me, I feel like it merged out of the impact that took place in Chile. And I think that was like 2016. So it was a good 5 years of listening and developing the science to ultimately get to publication for the MPA guide.
So that makes sense. So now, we have sort of the basis of why this paper kind of went through and why you did the paper. Beth, can you just start talking about some of the results that you found with this paper?
Yeah, sure. Well, so we actually only looked at 100 marine protected areas around the world. We picked the 100 largest. The 100 largest MPAs, the smallest one is about 35,000 square kilometers. So that's pretty big still. Yeah. But what we were able to do by focusing on that group of marine protected areas was essentially assess 90% of everything that's currently recorded as protected. So if you look at the WDPA number of 8%, 90% of that 8% is in the largest 100 MPAs. And there are actually over 18,000 MPAs in the WDPA database, which means 17,900 some odd MPAs are all smaller than 35,000 square kilometers.
Right.
And we didn't even look at those.
Go back to where I said 15,000 and change it to 18,000.
Yeah.
Apologies.
Just dub it in. We'll get that in post. Yeah.
All right. Sounds good.
And so what it does is it really drives home a couple of messages. The big message is that, countries that can have taken advantage of areas in their EEZ where there aren't a lot of people. And if there are people, they don't have a lot of political power to try to save these areas. And I'm not saying these places don't need to be protected. They do. They're as important as any other part of the ocean. But what it's resulted in is a very unrepresentative group of MPAs. Because we're heavily focused in the Pacific Islands area and not where the rest of us live. So like the largest MPA on the East Coast of the US isn't even in that top 100, right? And that's like the biggest one we have right here in the United States. So, so certainly it's a unique group of marine protected areas. And from it, you can't really get regional detail because we're looking at the largest MPAs in different countries. But it gives you a really good look at the global picture and where we're kind of falling short and maybe where some of these strategies could be better. With only a quarter of these not even being implemented, it seems like low-hanging fruit, since they're already on the map, to try and make some steps towards implementing them. Right. Because they've already, someone was like, well, there's not a lot of good news in this, is there? And I was like, well, if you look at it aspirationally, we want to protect these places. We're just not, right? But we could, because we've already identified them and we've put them out in the world as places that we think are worthy of protecting. And so, just sticking with them, identifying them, changing some things, there are places to go with this, right? Like, it's not like we're just starting from
Right.
scratch.
And I think also there's a level of, when we look at conservation, there's a level of, it's a big thing to get something announced, to get something, I guess it would, as Angelo, you mentioned earlier, like on
Mhm.
paper, when we talk about paper parks, that's a hard thing to do, to sort of identify the boundaries. The next step is the implementation, but at some points, like, at least we have something in place. It'll be easier to implement it.
Sometimes.
That's sort of where
I think
that's where we're
sometimes it
finding
makes it
that.
a bullseye, right? Like, so there are, we
Right.
certainly work with groups sometimes, because one of the things our platform tries to do is show proposed areas, places that are, in the
Yes.
pipeline. And there's a certain amount of, like, you don't want to put it out there till you've kind of set up some of these, because if you give opposition time to align, then it's stronger, and so sometimes people are afraid to put out there that they want to protect it. But in the case of these ones, that's not it. They're already out there. They've been
They're already out there,
proposed,
yeah.
and they really should be, places where you know, some work could be done and people could kind of find a common ground. The rubber meets the road a lot when it comes to zoning a place, or, really discussing what types of human activity should be getting done there. So it's a hard, it's actually, the implementing's much harder than the designating.
Right.
It's so much friction once you get to that point. But
Yeah.
in my view, if you're going to put that much effort into this, it's even worse to get that far and get nothing for it, right? Like, to have fought those battles and to have gotten that type of support and, like, worked so hard to get, this thing off the ground, and then have nothing to show for it, to me is,
Yeah.
also something that, and then, people turn around and go, well, MPAs don't work. And you're like, well, you didn't set it up to succeed, and certainly
Agreed.
how you set it at a marine protected area up is everything. If
Yeah,
the
for
community
sure.
doesn't support it, if the funding isn't there, if there's not a way for people there to make a living, it's not going to succeed.
Yeah. Well, even on the other side, Angela, you've been a part of a lot of MPA processes where you've helped groups, with their voice, and making sure that ocean users are represented at the table and providing resources and so forth. There's a lot of relationship building from all parties that go on in these types of processes that actually put together MPAs. And there's, for some MPAs, I can't speak for all of them, but for some MPAs, there's a concerted effort to ensure that all groups have, at the beginning of the process, a place at the table, a voice at the table, and to be able to contribute. There's a lot of work that goes in. There's a lot of relationship building, a lot of trust that needs to be built. It must be disrespectful for a lot of those groups if an MPA is announced but not implemented properly, because what was the point of all that? Did you ever uh, hear of that through looking at and reviewing the data, that some people are just felt disrespected, or you know sort of lose out on the process, or not support the process if it wasn't implemented because of after all the work they put in?
So I'm gonna give anecdotal evidence.
Right.
There are papers written on this. I actually have one publishing soon, talking about the
Nice.
Pacific Remote Islands. But at the onset, before designation, when NGOs are campaigning or communities are campaigning, there's a lot of excitement, a lot of positivity, and I do think most people go into it with um, positive intentions. Like, I don't think there's like these evil people out there trying to like close down fisheries. Like, I think it's actually from a place of the ocean's in trouble. Oh my God! Like, we need to do all, like, we need,
Yeah.
the world is burning. We need to fix it. I inadvertently might have mentioned there might be a little bit of white saviorism going on. But like, it's not purposely bad, but it does make its way into it. But in my career, I was a huge advocate for the marine monuments in the U.S. Pacific. And I think the theory of change there was that, once the United States government does something, uh, it gets implemented. When a president creates a monument, it gets a visitor center, it gets a ranger, it gets a superintendent. And I think for most of history in the United States, that has been true. Um, and a lot of the work on the ocean has been modeled after the Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument. And a lot of the work
Hmm.
around the world was basically trying to create cookie cutters of what has happened in Hawaii. And, just 15 years later, I think we've kind of realized that Hawaii is kind of a unicorn. It's got intact indigenous culture. So you've got these amazing connections, amazing story, but it's also part of the United States. It's a state. It has senators.
Hmm.
So when the protected area happens, there's a governor who can ask the federal government for money, and like it happens. Staff happens, management plans get created, um, but the territories are owned by the United States. And that just creates a very different dynamic. And so
Right.
I think what's happened in the US is that most of our protected areas, and again, this is like 99% of the coverage, have just been neglected, because the people who, at the time of designation, very supportive. You see pictures of people smiling at the designation and everyone's happy. Um, but they're not, because of colonialism, and because of the structures that exist, because you're a territory and a state. They have a really hard time accessing these federal resources, and it's more than just federal resources. It's also, Hawaii has a big university, so
Yeah.
you can go to school and you can get an education. You can become a professor, or you can become a researcher. um, and it's not just science. There's also the arts. So you can, go to school and you can become a writer or an artist, and the whole protected area gets tied up into all of that. So a lot of the benefits that, the way Hawaii has happened, and it's just amazing there. Like, the connection to the ocean in Hawaii,
Hmm.
at all levels. It's just incredible and inspirational. And we didn't understand the enabling conditions, right? So to bring that the scientific term, and so we use this cookie cutter approach. We didn't tailor the things to the realities and the territories, right? So we said, well, every other time we've created a monument, it results in a superintendent and a management plan and a visitor center.
Hmm.
And then there's research comes and you get to put your researchers on the vessels and, yada, yada, yada. But that just hasn't happened in the territories. That's the American experience. There's also a parallel French experience, a parallel uh, UK experience.
Yeah.
And I'm the like I literally am the biggest champion for these things. Like
Hmm.
I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's a phrase we use in the Catholic faith. It's I actually what I want to do is I want to make these things work. Of like, okay, we've been doing it for 15 years. We've failed a lot, but when you fail, you learn. So how can we
Yeah.
take those learnings, and how can we improve the management of these? How can we ensure that our kids are going to school so that they can study marine
Yeah.
biology? How do we ensure that when scientists are coming to our islands, that we're the ones who are issuing the permits? When decisions are made, can those decisions be made on Guam and Saipan instead of Honolulu and Washington, D.C.? So, there are
Right.
governance changes that need to be made with these protected areas to make them more equitable. Um, but in doing that, like, we'll implement it better, and 5 years will go by, 10 years will go by, and a movement will grow. Like, that's sort of like my
Hmm.
theory of change. Uh, this has worked in Hawaii. Like, we've seen it work in Hawaii. There's this amazing community committed to ocean conservation at so much holistic approach, so many different levels. Um, we know how it works in Hawaii. Uh, we haven't spent the time to figure out how that works in the territories. And, just knowing from Beth's paper that about 2/3 of the protected areas are mostly in these overseas territories of all these powerful countries. Like, guys, we got to figure this out, because
Yeah.
these islands are the ones delivering conservation. Like, they're the ones carrying the burden. And if it's going to
Right.
work, it's got to work their way. And so, it's some people hear this and they say, "Oh, you're criticizing this, you're opposed to it." It's like, actually, no, I actually think that there's a better way to do it, and that the
Yeah.
thing that matters more than getting that designation is the people who are involved in the process it takes to get there.
Yeah. So it seems like a lot of the overseas territory protected areas are more dictated from a different governance body rather than like a local community. Is that what you're saying? Is that what
No,
I'm
I
getting
I
at?
think at the
Or
time
that's
of
what you're getting at?
designation, for most of these, there is overwhelming support. I mean, that's, governments don't like
Right.
indigenous people
Okay.
screaming at them. I think there's maybe only one or two examples where a community has been steamrolled. But I,
Okay.
I think for the most part, at the time of designation, people are excited. They're like, "Oh, this is a great thing. We're very proud. We are
Right.
happy to carry this burden." But, like, a year goes by, a decade goes by, 15 years goes by. And what we've seen is, Hawaii, and then also Australia is a little bit of a unicorn. There
Right.
are a couple of countries, and we're heading off into like tangential territory here, but there are countries that control their own waters. So Kiribati, Palau,
Hmm.
and they created these protected areas, and they haven't seen the benefits flowing to the islands, and they have sovereignty, so they can roll back those protections. So
Right.
Kiribati has already rolled back those protections, and it's a hot topic in Palau, and you can Google. There's stories about it. I don't think any action has been taken, but it's a topic of discussion on the island. For all of the overseas territories, they don't have the power to overturn it, right? So
Mm.
they have to depend on the capital, Washington D.C., London, Paris. Like though, for the most part, that's where the power lies.
Yeah.
Um, and who other than like the guy who was in the White House before the current guy in the White House, like what leader wants to roll back conservation, right? You don't want to be the
Yeah.
guy to do that, or the
True.
woman. So the overturning these is not the way to go. Like that would also be it's not just because they're not being implemented well doesn't mean we give up, we throw up our hands. We actually need to dig in and work even harder.
Well, I think we have to perfect it not away from us, but close to us. I mean, we're seeing it with wind farm placement. We're seeing it with efforts to do anything different in the ocean, right near where we live. Is it's the pushback's very strong, to any type of protection from any type of impact. And it's made for some strange bedfellows. Republicans are out there trying to save the whales now because they
Yeah.
think that the sonar is killing the whales. And I mean, that's not what's happening, but whatever.
Right. Right.
Um, it's. I think we haven't learned how to do it closer to home. I think we're done hitting all the low hanging fruit per se, like the
Mm.
places where you could make these big gains and kind of rack up these wins, right? There's a bit of an arms race there in the 2000s to quick place these really large places, but we're there. We've really covered overseas territories, and I think hopefully some of these will even out, and either hopefully
Yeah.
Chagos and Mauritius will come to the table and they'll put something cool back on the map, and maybe we've learned some things there, but we sure haven't learned our lesson in our backyard either, and like how to
Right.
gain support, and I think a lot of it comes down to education. People routinely are shocked to find out that industrial fishing can happen in a marine protected area, and our paper shows not only can it often does. A third of
Yeah.
what's out there right now that we assess has some level of industrial fishing or extraction in it that you would never think could happen in a marine protected area. And so, I think there's a disconnect between what people think marine protected areas are doing and what they're actually doing.
Hmm.
Um, and I think there's a lot more support for strong protection. People just don't understand that they don't have that already. So I hope it
Yeah.
motivates people to learn more about what's happening. I hope it elevates the issue to a point. I mean, we haven't had too many people um, really push back on it. I mean, this is all stuff that most people knew going into it, that we weren't really holding up our end of the bargain on implementing things. We were trying to put fully and highly protected areas really far away from ourselves. And I think we all know what the homework assignment is. We just have to do it, and it's going to take time. And these smaller places are going to cost as much, if not more, than some of these bigger places ever did, because there's just a lot more people involved in these decisions. So
It's interesting. We talk about identifying the sort of what marine protected areas, like out of the 100, which ones have been doing well and how many are doing well, and how many have not been implemented. For the ones that have had that implementation, that kind of followed the criteria and met the criteria that you set out beforehand, what worked for them that was really good, like that helped for that implementation to go through?
well, the biggest, strongest protected MPA is in Antarctica. So being really far away
Is that the Ross
Yeah.
Sea MPA?
Yeah,
Is that the one?
that was pretty successful until it wasn't. Now they can't get any more MPAs through the CAMLAR process. But the first one was a banger.
It's too successful. Yeah.
The first one really, to this day, is a real gold standard. And again, actually, there is some industrial fishing happening in this.
Right.
Only one of those zones really keeps you from fishing in it, and it's not by design. It's just nobody's asked to do it. And it would allow fishing, it's just no one's doing it. So, and we just now are getting a high seas treaty. We're working on seeing it getting ratified, but even post ratification, it's going to take multiple years before anything's actually in place, right? So like we're really behind the 8 ball insofar as there's not a lot of big swaths of EEZ where unilateral country decisions can be made. We're going to have to start working collaboratively on the high seas, and the CAMLAR model, which I'm using the acronym, and maybe we should probably explain it to people.
For the Antarctica, where it's like 24 or 25 countries that have come together to put,
and there's 2 countries that
together.
don't want to see any of this happen ever, but they have to all agree. And so 1 or 2 countries continuously stop progress down there. And, maybe that's not the way you want to go with the rest of the high seas. Maybe that's a bad plan. Maybe we should go with, 90% agree, But again, then you come into if they don't agree with it, will they abide by it, right? And both of these countries have fishing interests and can just take their ball and go home, honestly, So there's a lot there. Maybe that would happen moving forward. But, I don't think there's an easy road left. But I think it's much like kind of the climate change, problem we're in too. Like I just read this Guardian article. Like climate change scientists are just depressed because they're like, there's no way this is staying under 3 degrees. Like we're blowing past 1.5. Like that was aspirational. Like we'd be lucky to stop at 3 right now. And they're saying things like, I'm just glad I don't have kids, and you're like, oh my God,
it's pretty devastating.
It's a pretty terrible situation. And I feel like with this paper, this wasn't news. The Marine Protection Atlas has long shown somewhere in the neighborhood of 3% is what we're actually hitting right now. And I've had people ask me if we're going to hit the 30% target. I'm like, I don't know why we would think that. We didn't hit 10% by 2010. We didn't hit 10% by 2012. We didn't hit 10% by 2020. We still haven't hit 10%. Just spoiler alert. We might not hit it. We might not hit it by 2030. So do I think we're going to hit 30%? No, I don't. But that doesn't mean there aren't avenues to try. And I think at the end of the day, you can't fix something if you don't know it's broken. And if we really understand the assignment here, if serious people really come to the table with serious intent, there's things that can be done. But you can't. I think I just don't want us sleepwalking into thinking we're doing enough. I hope this gets people riled a little bit to say we have to do better.
And there are some countries like the country I live, Canada. I remember from 2015 to 2019, there was a big push to put out more marine protected areas. There was a promise through the election that Prime Minister Trudeau would be like, okay, we're at 1%. We wanted to raise it to about 10 to 15%. I think 15% was the number. They got close. And they were designated MPAs like that, like just boom, we're going to extend this one. We're going to put one up north. Again, they did like to go where people were. The hydrothermal vents where it's like nobody's around. And so, but they were huge swaths of area that really pumped up that number. And I feel like this push 30 by 30 can cause that sort of designation. Sort of, I'm not going to say paralysis, but boom, it's easy to designate, especially the low hanging fruit. But as you said, at some point, whether those are implemented or not, at some point, you're going to have to get to areas where there's going to be conflict. There's going to be areas where it's going to be like a problem. Do you find that a lot of countries are sort of designated just for the sake of meeting that 30 by 30, Angelo? I know you've been like looking at that, for quite some time.
Yeah, the goal of getting to 30% has sometimes and the goal of 30% is international relations, right? 30 by 30 is not, it did come out of the biodiversity conference, but the way it is talked about most of the time is as international relations. Um, so yeah, certainly some countries want to get 30% because they want to go to our ocean, and they want to meet Leonardo DiCaprio and announce that they've protected 30%. Um, I tend to be a little bit more optimistic, though. Some of my co-authors say only a third of this is implemented and well designed, and I'm like, hey, at least it's a third.
Right.
And fisheries management isn't going great either. If you look at the FAO puts out their Sophia report every 2 years, like the number of fisheries that are overfished has been going up since my entire
Yeah.
lifetime. It's like
Yeah.
quadrupled my lifetime. The amount of fish that is maximally sustainably fished, again, it's through the roof. Um,
Hmm.
and I used to work on sharks for a number of years. Something like 4% of shark fishing is sustainable, right? So if we're going to say that fisheries works, it's like, oh, fisheries isn't so great either. But I am optimistic because it does work when all the ingredients are there. And you asked what those ingredients are, and many people have written other papers about this, but it really comes down to time, money, and people. And
Right.
we talked about the Ross Sea. It took a decade to negotiate that, but everybody agreed to it, and everybody is following it, right? Nobody was steamrolled. Everybody had their
Right.
say. They negotiated like the specific things that they needed, and now, for the most part, all the countries that are down there are following it. You
Yeah.
also see, like I've
It did get shot down a couple of times too, right? Like
yeah,
there was
oh
a
yeah,
few
it took
years where it didn't
years.
get
It took a
passed.
decade. It took forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
The folks who work down, they maybe even long, the people who work on the high seas, it's taken 20
Hmm.
years to negotiate that.
Yeah.
And again, it's not perfect,
Right.
but it creates a shared framework that brings fisheries and deep sea mining and shipping and all of these different sectors to the same table. And it's probably going to take another 20 years. Like, let's be honest, before they start creating some of these big protected areas on the high seas. And I think we can look at where we've come. I remember I at the time that I was on your first show in like maybe 2010, a
Yeah.
very common a
I
very
thought you said
common
it was
talking
what,
point.
1824 or
Well, I said it
something.
was 1826.
1820.
Um,
Yeah. 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 Before we were born. It was really
before we were
interesting. It's
born,
a
yeah, this
spiritual
podcast has been
form.
on
Yeah.
forever. But a very common talking point is that less than 1% of the ocean is protected. And in that
Yeah.
decade, from 2010 to 2020, we went from less than 1% to 7.9%, and then it stopped. And the reason it stopped was COVID. And then there
Mm.
was the inflation, and then there was the
Hmm.
war in Ukraine. So like the world right now is not the same world that we lived in 10 years ago. International relations are frayed,
Mm.
in every country. So getting to international agreements on marine protected areas is affected by the world that we live in. Um, but I think we can. I am optimistic, as Beth talked about the quarter of the protected areas that are well designed but not implemented. Let's implement them, right? That gets us to half. And
Yeah.
then there are areas that are poor designed, and maybe some of those we can design better, maybe, but it's going to take time.
At the end of the
That's going to,
day,
Right.
you can't say there's nothing we can do because we caused this. You know, the whole thing's happening because of us. The
Yeah.
only way it stops is with us. The impact of what's happening to our world is not out of our control. It's 100% within our control. It was started by us. It's
Right.
being continued by us, and it can be stopped by us. In fact, nobody else is going to do it. I love my dogs, but I bet you they're not going to save us from, you know,
Yeah.
from this. And to say that there's nothing we can do is like, well, I don't know who you think's going to do it for you because it's only us. Like
Yeah.
that's how we got here. It's the only way we get back out. And like Angelo said, when we started the Atlas, we were at like under 2%, and that was 10 years ago.
Yep.
So
Yep.
it can be done. It's been done. It can be done again, and it just takes just sheer will. And I think we're starting to see enough of the results of inactivity. I have a
Hmm.
lot of hope for. I mean, Gen X. We were joking about ourselves earlier, but we're small. We're kind of stuck between a really big generation and another big generation. I don't know if we're ever
Yeah.
going to get a president of the United States. I mean, I don't know if the boomers are ever going to give it up, but the next one's going to be like two generations behind us. Yeah.
Yeah, they're holding on tight.
We're never going to rule the place, but
no.
At the end of the day, I think the kids are all right, and I have a lot of hope for what I see.
Yeah.
They're just really aware of it, and that's the best thing. They at least know what's happening.
Yeah.
Right? Like we we're all busy listening to grunge rock and whatever, and talking and hearing people talk about this threat that wasn't upon us yet, right?
Yes.
And now it's here,
yeah.
and these kids are in it, and I'll be damned if they can't do something about it. I don't know what they're going to do, but I'm sure
Agreed.
they'll do something. I hope, but like all we can do is get the word out. All we can do is set a baseline. All we can do is set some reality to it and say we have a lot more to do. And it's not going to be easy, but we can do it. Like Angelo was saying, look behind us. We've gotten.
Yeah.
Stuff has happened. So.
Well, and with that said, did the study look at some of the like Angelo, you mentioned earlier, sometimes the funding didn't come through right away or at all, when we talk about this implementation. Did the paper, were you able to highlight some of the major things in common that of the parks that weren't implemented, the challenges that they were going through?
In some cases we did, but oftentimes it was just kind of a stalling of the process. Right. It gets real hard to put a management plan down. So beyond implementation, there's a stage that the MPA guide calls actively managed. And that's really where you want to get. Implementation is good, but implementing and then checking your work, looking back at it,
right.
Every 5 years saying, all right, did this work? Is it working? Are we seeing what
right.
we think? Do we need to do more? Do we need to do less? Do we need to change?
Yeah.
That's where you really get the results. And that's where you get better out of imperfect, right? So just putting
right.
something there and then go, well, that didn't work, and then never coming back to it's not going to work. It's just going to get...
It's that adaptive management piece, right?
Yeah, and so the active management's super important, and there's a colleague of ours that just did a paper that really highlights the importance of actively managing a park to get it, beyond even implementation into like kind of really pushing out and getting better at what it's accomplishing, and we tend to not do that well, and so I think it takes a long time. Some of these larger places, like Angelo alluded to, have been undone, since we did the paper. We took Phoenix Islands back down, but it was in the paper when we did the analysis, and so we are seeing some of these things kind of balance out a little bit, but the hope would be that we've identified it, just a little bit of calling out, because most of these are big countries that can do better, that really ought to do better.
More resources, more money.
They have a lot of resources. They've got the ability to do it. We talk about Marianas Trench a lot, Angelo and I, because we're a good time at a bar, and we've discussed, just the effectiveness of that MPA by virtue of its placement in the U.S. EEZ. Because it's in U.S. waters, that already lends it some effectiveness, right? Because we can defend our boundary, right? So, there is a little bit of that. And so we have the means to do better, and we should be doing better. And so I think some of it's fair to call these places out, but also to say, others can do more, but we should be doing more.
So how do we do more? Like who does, is it within like the governments need to do more of their own respective countries in their EEZ? Or is it like, I have a lot of audience members here that are listening to this and being like, I want to do something. What can I do? Like, where's the call? What's the call to action from, is it more on the scale of government, like engage with your government representation, which we always encourage? Or is it support is it at the nonprofit level, or the think tank level?
I think you support the people that are doing the work. That's one. But two, I was talking the other day and I was like, government works for us, not the other way around. Like government is not leaders. They're not leaders. They're led by us. And,
that's a really interesting way.
If they hear from us, if that's what we want, that's what they have to do, voting is your superpower. And once you become a voter, becoming engaged with your leaders. I've had conversations with my senators and my representatives about how important the ocean is to me. And I live in New England where fishing rules, and I'm like, I would like to see, some of our oceans set aside. If I get a vote in how my square acre is used, my acre of ocean, I want it protected. And so I think you have to give them the political will. They have no spines. We're seeing it
Right.
across the board that government doesn't work for themselves. They work for us, but if you don't tell them what you want, they're not going to stand up for what's right.
True.
I hope
True.
the kids get loud.
And,
I think things
Yeah.
like these, I think marches, I think putting your money where your mouth is. I think there's a lot of awareness. You see so many companies now donating some of their profits. There's a real awareness of and that's pushed by the people buying their stuff. They buy
Right.
their stuff and they want you to donate money to good causes. And that wasn't companies just going, let's go do something good. That was being pushed there. So I hope that people start speaking up, and they won't until they know. So, things like this podcast are so important.
Yeah, no, totally agree. I'm going to clip that, by the way, and I'm going to put that.
I'm going to need
because
people
you said
I need
podcast
someone to
is so
start an
important.
MPA cartoon.
Yeah,
Like a Simpsons.
yeah, an NFT or
Simpsons
something,
for
right?
the
Where you have
protected areas. Something people want to
Yeah,
watch.
Well,
there
we
you
had Captain
go.
Planet growing up, right?
That's true. We did.
We had Captain Planet.
Yeah, and Smokey
Yep.
the Bear.
Smokey
I mean,
the Bear.
I am very aware of forest fires.
Yeah, and only we can prevent them. That was the call to action.
Hello,
right?
We all know how
Yeah.
bills get made because there was cartoons that taught us how to do it.
That's true.
Know?
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. Angelo, like from your perspective too, like you work with a lot, like your work entails working with a lot of indigenous groups all over the US, and some that are along the coast, some that are inland, dealing with protected areas in a lot of different varieties. Can you speak on sort of the approach and sometimes frustration from some of these indigenous groups in terms of the lack of implementation, or even like where they sit with marine protected areas and sort of taking over the management of some of those MPAs?
So we don't talk enough about how exclusionary the history of conservation has been. This is one of my favorite books. It's Encounters with the Archdruid by John McPhee, where he follows David Brower around to a couple different sites where he worked. It was mostly written in the 60s and 70s. And it's a fun read because they actually talk about protecting 10% of nature, and comparing what they were talking about in the 70s to what we're talking about in the 2020s. Every single character in this book is an old white dude. So I was born in the 1970s. And so in my lifetime, when I was born, the only people who were allowed to participate in conservation were old white dudes and Sylvia Earle. And she had a hard time. They gave her a hard time. And so, the movement has grown to include a lot of white women. And, you look at the structures of a lot of NGOs today, and you'll see oftentimes the CEO is an older white dude. A lot of the directors are, qualified women, white women. And then a lot of the junior staff are young women of color. It is a female-dominated workplace that we work in. And it's just been very exclusionary. And, you think about knowledge and ways of knowing and science, and the way we have conducted conservation for the last 100 years has not been very objective, because we only listen to the opinions of a very small slice of our communities. And I think that's beginning to change. I think there's still a long way to go.
Right.
Or during this interview or during this podcast, we talked about just how different cultures experience the sacred. And so there cannot be a cookie cutter approach to how humans live with nature. We all do it slightly differently. And for most of the history of conservation, right up until the day that I was born and for most of my life, we just haven't listened to all the great ideas that many other people around the world have. Women, people of color, indigenous peoples, people from poor countries. There's still a lot of parachute science. There's a lot of parachute conservation. And we've got a long way to go to make that stop happening.
My first marine mammal conference was in 1999. And it was all older white men walking around with cadres of women who were all their interns and like, just it was just like a guy and then a bunch of women moving around. And that was like every lab that was at the Marine Mammal Conference. And, that's no longer the case. Those women have all grown up and they all have their own
Now they're
labs.
directors.
And I was watching a West Wing the other night, and it was the one where CJ's father is getting dementia, but he was a math teacher. And they're having a conversation. He said, for years, women were terrible at math. Do you want to know why? And she goes, because all the teachers were old white men who didn't want to teach women. He's like, yeah, pretty much, And so as women have moved up the ranks, like a thing that is different about how we operate is that most of us pull people up behind us. It's more inclusionary, like the conversations are different. The way that we interact with one another. I've seen it in the boat space too, because my other hat is as a captain. And, there's a lot of female deckhands now and a lot of women moving up. But it's because there's people in front of them saying, here's how you do it. We got through these walls, and folks like Angelo who live in DC and have found a way to have a voice can go back and show people this is how you do it. Maybe they can do it from home now because we don't all have to live where we work. But it's people breaking through that and then making sure you take people with you that makes the difference. And then you get more people thinking differently in the space, and that can only go well. There's all sorts of cool small scale fisheries work where the women are leading the work. This is great. This is what we need. We need more voices and more experience, lived experience in the space. So it's encouraging. It's changed a lot.
Yeah.
Not to say,
it has
not to keep saying how old we are, but to have seen that kind of change in our lifetime is encouraging.
And to continue to see it changing as well, right? We're seeing that evolution of the different, the different people and faces that are representing different regions around the world at conferences and on papers and whatnot, and standing up for themselves and getting more of a voice, you can see it just even in the podcasting world. I see it, which it's very encouraging to see. We still have a long way to go, but it's very encouraging to see that. So, but this has been a great conversation to see a very, optimistic conversation, which I wasn't sure.
I didn't think we'd be this optimistic either. Just for the record, right? I'm impressed with us.
It's that Generation X. We're still optimistic. We can still make a change, and it helps. It starts, with people like yourselves who are kind of identifying this. I think there's this push for 30 by 30, but there has to be, stipulations. There has to be a level of excellence that we not only expect but achieve. And papers like this identify that. It's not just to crap on the work that everybody's done. It's to say we could do better, and we need to do better to be able to protect this. Not only to get the 30 by 30 in terms of geographic coverage, but also making sure that we're hitting our targets and hitting and adapting and sort of doing that active management to be able to make sure that we continue to evolve and the parks and the MPAs continue to evolve as well. So I appreciate both of you for coming on and sharing this. Love to have you back on. Of course, there's an open invitation for both of you to come back on and discuss more things about marine conservation. Angela, you have one thing to say?
I'm just giving you thumbs up.
Oh, thumbs up. Nice. I love it. But yeah, this has been perfect. Thank you so much to the both of you. And thank you for the paper as well as your co-authors. And we really appreciate you coming on the show.
Andrew.
Thank you, Beth and Angelo, for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast, talking about marine protected areas and talking about how effective some of these protected areas are. And, when I first started this podcast, when I first doing the interview, I was like, oh, this might be a pessimistic interview. This might get people down. But it actually ended up being pretty optimistic. We were actually surprised afterwards. We were talking about, it's like, this was actually quite optimistic of ourselves. Pat on the back for doing this. Because, when you look at a paper like this, identifying some of the gaps and some of the, maybe we didn't hit the targets as well as we think we are, even though the announcements say we are, these are important papers. This is what science is all about. It's what conservation is all about. It's to making sure that when we start to talk about things like 30 by 30, we are making sure that we're doing it properly. We may not hit the target of 30 by 30, or 30%. But if we even hit above 10%, or above 15%, or even above 9%, we're going to hit something that we've never hit before. And we're going to continue to make progress. And I think that is the message here today, is to make sure that we are always hitting progress. There are a lot of things that we can do to improve some of these implementations of the MPAs. And we highlighted it today, and it's going to continue to get highlighted as we move forward. This is just the beginning of the conversation of making sure that the implementation of marine protected areas go forward. And there's a lot of studies on it. There's a lot of papers that have been written on this, and a lot of studies and papers that have been written on getting to that point of designation. That's always been the focus. Now we're really on the focus of how effective are these? Like, are they actually doing well? Have they been implemented? We're gonna and what's been rolled back? What's been working? What hasn't been working? And that's as we get more and more MPAs coming in that are effective, that are being implemented. Now we can measure the effectiveness and seeing where we can learn and how we can get better at marine protected areas and managing those marine protected areas. So that's the message, overall message for today. But again, talk to your representative, your government representative, wherever you live. If you live in a democratic society, this is where you can really have an opinion. Get your friends to talk about if it's important to them. Making sure that you engage with your federal, state, or provincial and local government and representative. That is a key. Also, supporting nonprofit organizations like the Marine Conservation Institute, like the Center for American Progress, even like this podcast, who want to talk about this, who want to call out things that aren't working and making sure that they get better, and making sure that we're doing well with marine protected areas and protecting the ocean. There's a lot to be done. There's a lot of work that is being done, and we want to make sure those are supported, and not just sort of the announcements are supported. And we just hear an announcement and be like, oh, that's good. We don't have to worry about that anymore. We still need to do a lot of work on protecting the ocean, not only in the exclusive economic zone, the EEZs, but also in the high seas, with the High Sea Treaty coming into effect and starting to be ratified by more and more groups, as the European Union just ratified as well. So lots of stuff to do, but we're stepping with 1 foot forward at a time, and step by step we're going to be able to get this. So I think I used enough cliches for that. We're going to end it right there. If you want to talk to me about this episode, you can do so by hitting me up on Instagram. DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of ways you can get a hold of me, but that's probably the best way of doing so. And I'll put the information to the paper, the links to the website, that all the press release, the paper itself, and all this stuff that you can get on the Marine Conservation Institute website. And I'll put all the ways to connect with Beth as well as Angelo in the show notes as well. So that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.